Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight's video has been graciously sponsored by Loot Crate, their specialist crate for all things creepy, fright. So let's have a look at what's inside. First up, we have this amazing t-shirt from Halloween 2. Next up, we've got this black box. Ooh, Baba Yaga. Absolutely beautiful bookmark. Very nice. Next up, we have a pin. I do love pins. Kind of looks like a skinwalker, even though it says Mordeo. Not really sure what that is. We'll have to Google it. Next up, we have some teeth. Very nice. Phone holder teeth. I really needed one of these as well. Was meaning to get a phone holder. Ooh. Next up, we have a book from The Shining. Check out that detail. I mean, that detail is amazing. Overlook Hotel. The floor pattern, very nice. Oh, and if you check out the pages, don't know if you can see that, but that is pretty awesome. Very nice. Right then, next up we have... Oh, it's a scene frozen in time from The Evil Dead 2. Ta-da! And here you have it. This is what the finished product looks like. Pretty creepy if I do say so myself. Perfect for any wall or shelf. And there you have it. We got the shirt, we got the plush doll, we got the teeth phone stand, we got the Shining notebook, we got an Evil Dead 2 collectible figurine, as well as the beautiful Baba Yaga bookmark. I really love this collection and this set. If you are interested in getting a Fright Crate, be sure to get yours today. By following the link in the description, you get 15% off, or alternatively, you can use my code mortismedia15 to get that 15% off. Like I said, link is in the description. Thank you so much to Loot Crate for sending me this, but for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek throughout woodlands and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight, which is what I would need to do during the real thing, but we hiked 10 miles through woods in a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, until all of a sudden, there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be in his late 70s or perhaps early 80s. Very pale, with liver spots dotting his face and a grey and white comb over to match. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought is that seeing some guy at this age out in the woods in these clothes and in these weather conditions is that this guy has certainly lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice though that puzzled me. He was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He began flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After a minute, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him and continued following the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope. It was probably a 40-degree angle and spanned for at least 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross it so quickly and cleanly. I mean, at that distance it's hard to see any fine detail clearly at all, but I swear he didn't appear wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge and was going to try and make my way down, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. "Something's wrong here," he said under his breath. We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started to get irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down at the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services. That professional help would be on its way soon, and they would have all the tools that they needed to help. The old man then got furious and began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right away, or there would be hell to pay. His voice changed drastically at this point. He was now practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets, his skin gone pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came in, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter mile or so to the car, all the while my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possibly mentally ill man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police so that we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and a pack of supplies like first aid and emergency blankets. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes, and the search lasted a weekend, but there was never any trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date. The details I have on this story are very vague, but someone told me about a teenager who went into the Asylum National Forest to hike and then was reported missing several days later when he didn't return home. A couple of months later, he was found in the woods, and he was like a different person. He appeared to be either drunk or under the influence, but when he was tested, everything came back negative. Mentally, he wasn't all there, but physically wasn't showing any signs of being exposed to anything which would cause this. He kept telling people that he encountered something very strange. It was several months before he was himself again, and he had very little memory of what had happened all those days. I've asked people that I know who live in Akala or have camped and hiked in the Akala National Forest, and they'd never heard of this story. I really didn't know if this person who told me this story knew if it was true or not. Sounds like it might be true and strange, and weird things have happened in state and national parks. But I do know that over the years, people have gone into the Akala National Forest and never come out. Some of them were harmed or killed by animals. Others had their lives ended abruptly by other humans. And some just vanished without a trace. I've driven through the forest on State Highway 40, and at night, it's creepy, even in the day at times. My dad grew up on a forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life we've spent a lot of time out in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel on occasionally. One place that my dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the forest that was impossible to find unless you knew where it was. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades until the 90s, and had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in the bar who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forest, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated, but the vibe was always the same. That straight-up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place when we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. But Dad didn't seem too concerned. One trip when I was a teenager, things got strange real quick. My friends and I were piled into my dad's 4x4 and were driving through the bushes to Spike's, so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite Spike's hut, there were what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log, hat over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way you'd sit if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of work, and even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of by the property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us get out the car at Spike's, as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing, but that if the figure was still there when we came back, he'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up as he drove us through the forest a bit. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped-over cowboy again, not having moved an inch, still in the same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of the promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors and drove off the farm faster than he'd ever driven on those dirt tracks before. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we all knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile and at best dangerous. My dad denied any of the events that day ever happening after that, but my friends and I were still curious about what was going on out there. So a few months later, we went camping on our own to see if we could find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it without Dad's help. Something was just off once we got there, more so than usual for that day. My mates jumped out the car, but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I'd spent 2 hours finding the place and I was gonna explore it. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants, with nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back any minute, or that they'd never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of small shed with 3 walls, and I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ash from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill made from crossed-hatched wire sitting over the fire, hinged on the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I fear that whoever has been here has been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever, actually. But then my stomach dropped. As my eyes traveled down from the grill to the ground, I saw a baby sock. Tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. Then another. Then a shirt, a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to get out. Some ranger or crazy old bushy hanging out at that trashed hut was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there. There's no way anything good could have come from having a child's clothes right under a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our stuff and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing persons in the area in an attempt to explain either the cowboy or the kid's clothes, but I can tell you, I will never make the mistake of going out to Spike's without my father again. I was born and raised in Charlotte and still live on the east side. There is a local public park near my parents' house called McAlpine Creek, which is mainly a large cross-country trail stretching miles across East Charlotte. The park is enveloped by hundreds of acres of dense forest and underdeveloped land that is discreetly amidst busy streets and highways. You almost don't realize how big the forest stretches because of the infrastructure around it. There is a myth, folklore tales about a devil church or Satan church deep within the park. There are a few videos on YouTube and other forum posts around the web of local attempts to approach it. A simple Google search, and you'll surely find it. In my senior year of high school, scourging the internet about the supposed church, I had somehow found a somewhat vague description of the location from someone who had attempted to go down the roads deep within the park to find it. My girlfriend at the time and I, one Friday night, decided to try and find the road that leads to the church. We drove down the winding roads behind a Carmax that borders the dense woods of the park, where there is a small neighborhood of sorts. Cautiously driving down these quiet and dark roads, we had found a seemingly abandoned dirt track offshooting from the paved road. Keep in mind there are almost no streetlights anywhere. While driving for about 2 to 3 minutes, there had been a pickup truck in front of us, maybe 50 feet or so away. Upon seeing the dirt track, our interests peaked. We stopped the car to discuss what we wanted to do. We began to slowly pull onto the dirt track. Simultaneously, the pickup truck ahead of us abruptly stopped and sat in place. We noticed this, having fully pulled into the dirt road at this point, and immediately stopped and stood still, frozen in panic. The driver of the truck quickly put his or her car in reverse, and we could see the rear reverse lights on, and began to immediately back up towards us. I threw my car in reverse in panic and attempted to turn back the way we had come. I was able to get turned around and back into the driveway fairly quickly. In reverse, the driver of the truck was accelerating very fast towards us, and I floored the gas of my Nissan Altima, and the truck driver followed us for a few seconds and then stopped. We never looked back. We never found the supposed church, but this happening scared the hell out of us, and I've never considered attempting to return. I have to preface this story by saying that yes, I was young and dumb, and made some major mistakes here. I don't need any judgments, trust me, I know how stupid I was. But on to the story. I was 18 years old and had just joined the army. I was doing my basic training in Georgia in the middle of summer. I was struggling with some mental issues at the time, and to make a long story short, I was in the process of getting chaptered out of the army, aka quitting. My squad mates and even drill instructors had all told me it was going to take months for me to get out, and I'd still be stuck there past Christmas. Mind you, this was June. I was very distraught about the thought of being stuck there, forced to do meaningless chores till January, while my mental state deteriorated. But then a drill sergeant decided it would be fun to deceive me, and convinced me that if I went AWOL, ran away, and made it home, they would simply send me my discharge papers and I would be free. Looking back now, that was clearly a trick, but at the time I was desperate and bought into what he said. I hatched a plan to sneak out at night with a buddy from another unit. We were going to walk on the train tracks in the nearest town and catch a bus home. Easy enough, right? The night finally came for our escape. I snuck out of my barracks and headed to the meeting point. Upon arrival, I noticed my buddy wasn't there, and after waiting 30 minutes I realized he wasn't coming. It was too late for me to try and sneak back in, so I was on my own. I headed to the tracks, made it right onto them, and headed into what I thought was the direction of town. Boy, was I wrong. Walking on the tracks in the middle of the night, surrounded by woods, was a bit creepy, but I figured it wouldn't be long, and that I'd get to where I needed to be. After walking for over an hour, it hit me. Maybe these tracks weren't going to take me where I needed to go. And when I found a dirt path, I made the stupid decision to leave the tracks and follow that instead. The path led me past some fake houses set up for training and continued into the woods. This whole time, mind you, it's dark, and I have nothing but the moonlight to see with. I kept hearing noises in the woods and seeing shapes in the trees and bushes lining my path. Eventually on this path, I spotted some kind of wild dog wolf sitting just off the left side. By the time I had noticed it, it was too late to go back. My only option was forward. I faced the animal and backed up against the right side of the path as much as possible and slowly kept moving down it, never taking my eyes off the canine. Oddly, he never moved or showed aggression, just watched me as I inched by him. Possibly because he was full, or maybe he just wasn't interested in me. I honestly had no idea. After passing him, I continued until my path died and ended in a 50-foot drop. At this point, it had been hours. It was hot. I was alone, scared and thirsty. I had no idea where I was or what my next move should be. So I glanced around my surroundings, and the only thing I could see besides the wood was a radio tower off in the distance to my right. Here is where I made my big mistake. I decided the radio tower couldn't be that far away, and someone had to be there to help me, right? So I left my path, headed into the woods straight towards the radio tower. As you can imagine, it didn't take me long to realize once I headed into the woods that now not only was I lost, but I was lost in the almost pitch black woods, with no way to find my way out. I continued to march in the direction I thought the tower might be in, slowly losing hope of ever seeing anyone again. Now tired and bleeding from my legs thanks to thorn bushes and my dumb idea of wearing shorts, I was on the brink of giving up, where I came across a dry creek bed with a log in the middle, and out of frustration and hopelessness I climbed onto the log and screamed as loud as I could for someone to help me, which of course got no response. After several more screams, I heard a rustling in the bushes on the creek bank behind me, and I turned around just in time to see 3 wild dogs jump out of the bush and glare at me like I was dinner time. I absolutely lost it here. I ran in the opposite direction of them as I heard them taking off after me. I was terrified, running through the darkness with them chasing me, screaming at the top of my lungs and thinking that this was going to be how I'd die, painfully torn apart by wild dogs in the woods and then eaten. I don't know how far or for how long I ran, but eventually I came to a downed tree that was leaning on another, and I scurried up, praying they wouldn't climb it. I finally looked behind me and they were gone, nowhere to be seen. I wasn't sure if they had stopped chasing me, but I was relieved that I hadn't become their dinner. The rest of the night is mostly a blur of walking through dark woods and hearing other animals. At one point I couldn't do it anymore and was just gonna lay down and give up. As I sat down facing my own mortality, the thought hit me that they probably wouldn't even think to search the woods for me, and that my family, friends, and girlfriend would never have any idea of what truly became of me. That thought is what kept me going, and made me continue to try and find my way out. Eventually the sun came up, and I had survived the night. The lights brought with it some comfort since I could now see everything. After a few more hours, I stumbled upon a ribbon tied to a tree, which out here could only mean one thing: a land navigation marker for training. I knew that if I kept following the ribbons, they would eventually lead me out. And eventually, they did. I made it back to the path and ran into a sergeant who was heading out in his truck to go fishing. He returned me to my unit, and I paid for my actions and was eventually discharged. I learned a lot from this experience and have a wonderful life now, and I'm thankful for every day that I'm alive, and will never go into the woods again without a flashlight. While this experience was terrifying and life-changing, I am glad I went the wrong way on that track and didn't make it AWOL, or I would have gone to jail and not been where I am today. I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by wooded areas and of course dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down to a trail. This trail curved through the marsh into a big patch of woods about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall/spring, after heavy rains, the fog would often settle over the marsh as it was much lower than the surrounding area, and it truly looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. After one of these rains, my brother and I, he was probably 13 and I 16, decided it would be a great idea to go explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we could make it to the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would be dark by the time we got home, and headed for the trail. Once we were in the trail and moving, it just hit us how thick this fog was. We only had been walking for about a minute or two, but we had absolutely no visibility left behind us, and 5 to 10 feet max in front of us. We continued walking for a few more minutes, chatting about hearing noises and seeing red eyes in the distance the whole time, until we came to a curve in the trail. This curve signaled that we were only about 100 yards from the entrance to the woods. At this point there is a small lake on the left side of the trail, and miles of marshland on the right. It's important to note that we have moved further and further away from any house. Our house was the closest to the trail, and the trail moved away from our neighborhood rather than bordering any backyards. We began walking past the lake, and then we heard a splash, definitely larger than a fish jumping, but we had no idea what else would have made that noise. We stopped, waited, and upon hearing nothing else, continued on our way. We couldn't have been gone for more than 15 seconds when we heard cracking and shuffling in the brush up ahead of us to our left. We stopped dead in our tracks and waited. At the end of our eyesight, which could have only been about 10 feet, a figure stepped out from the brush bordering the lake. The fog was too thick to make out many details, but it must have been at least 6'4" and very broad-shouldered. As the figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and it stopped. Its head shot over and looked right at us and just stared. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I felt true horror at that moment, and I've never replicated that feeling. I began to take a small step backwards, and suddenly, the figure took off running into the marshland. Again, there are no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction that it ran. Suffice to say, my brother and I sprinted back to the house faster than I've ever done before. I still don't know who or what I saw that day. I hope I never do. This whole thing probably happened around 6 or 7 years ago. I lived in the middle of nowhere in Ohio and had to make my own fun growing up. I was around 16 at the time, and my friends and I decided to start ghost hunting on the weekends. We've experienced small stuff here and there, nothing too insane, until we went to Rogues Hollow. Now, Rogues Hollow was this old mining town where there were fires, diseases, etc., that eventually made the town cease to exist. It's now a national or state park. I'm not sure. One of the two. But, anywho, we decided it's worth exploring. First off, this place is in the middle of absolutely nowhere. I drove a 98 Chrysler Concorde in those days, and it was an absolute chore getting there. The gang shows up, there's a total of 4 of us, and it's getting pretty late, and we notice the house/lodge where the park ranger stays, so we park a bit off to avoid getting caught. The gang shows up, there's a total of 4 of us, it's getting pretty late, and we notice the house/lodge where the park ranger stays, so we park a bit off to avoid getting caught. Didn't work out too well. 5 minutes later, we're being questioned by an old guy who was the lone park ranger. He ended up being pretty cool and telling us some of his personal experiences. He said we could continue if we promised not to do any witchcraft or satanic rituals. Apparently that was a big problem that he was dealing with. At this point, we ventured back into the woods where the town previously was, and stuff started getting weird. We could hear what sounded like pickaxes, men working, and voices in many different directions. Needless to say, we were getting a bit on edge and decided to start recording our own little EVP device to see if we could find any stuff. We were getting words like fire, death, devil, and collapse. Eventually, we stumbled on an old house. It definitely wasn't inhabitable and was about 50% burnt down, while the others stayed back. As we approached the door, we turned back to our friends to give the old wish us luck, and they were sheet white looking at the second-story building. Directly above us, looking out the window down at us, was a man from the shoulders up and slightly transparent. Then he disappeared. Not leaning back into the house, he was simply gone. Usain Bolt would have been proud of my sprint time leaving that place. Fast forward to the next day, and we're deciding to go back and explore in broad daylight. We were walking around in 2 groups, about 10 yards apart from one another. I was in the back too, about 100 yards in from the wood line, and all of a sudden my friend and I both get grabbed on our shoulders simultaneously, hearing a very soft but distinctive, "Hello." At this time we turned and booked it out of there, and I haven't been back since. Here's one of my stories from when I lived off the grid in the forest of western North Carolina. Some friends and I lived in these small shacks, essentially a shed with a loft, that were very close together. Living in such primal enclosed conditions breeds a kind of deep, trusting friendship that you can't get from living anywhere else. So naturally, we did almost everything together. By our little semicircle of houses, there was a railroad track that if you followed it south would lead to a waterfall. This waterfall in particular is where everyone would go to get high. It was a normal night, humid, sometime in early July, and a group of about 6 friends and I, Laura, Andy, Nick, and some of Andy's friends that I didn't know that well but recognized, decided to walk out to this waterfall in the dark. I was the only sober one in the group, so I felt a higher sense of responsibility for everyone and was therefore on edge and hyper-aware of our surroundings. Others would walk faster or slower or stop altogether in the group, so it was natural and expected that we wouldn't be able to see everyone at the same time. Andy was in rare form though. When Laura had to stop to pee, he came out of the bushes and scared her, and then ran off ahead behind the rest of the group. This annoyed both me and Laura since it was such a clear invasion of privacy and unnecessarily spooked in the already spooky night. Laura and I eventually got into where we could see Andy again, but he was walking by himself and then slipped back into the bushes without even looking at us. Dismissing him as just being high, we kept moving forwards, still not back with the whole group yet, and we realized that Andy has followed in behind us, just far enough away that we can only see his silhouette. Finally, we catch up with the rest of the group and see that all of us are accounted for, even Andy. We asked him how he got ahead of us and beat us to the group when he had last been seen 15 yards behind us just a minute ago. Everyone was dead silent, and Laura and I realized that whoever scared her when she peed and followed us wasn't Andy or anyone from our group. We never did make it to that waterfall. I was backpacking through Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina with my dog, just the 2 of us, and we were exploring the woods around Little Lost Cove, open orienteering style, so we were not on an established trail. We'd been hiking through the day following a creek, and towards the evening I noticed my dog was acting abnormally. She was very much caught in the scent of something and wouldn't ease up. This continued for about 2 hours before we made camp. That night in camp she remained on edge and stared off into the woodline. I went about camp business as usual. Then at around midnight I got this prick like I was being watched intently. I let the feeling ride for a bit and kept tinkering with the fire. Then I heard the brush rustle. I got up from the fire and shone my flashlight in the hillside. A figure on all 4s just managed to escape the beam, all but the tail. It was a tail I knew that was not supposed to still exist in the southern Appalachians. I cast my light across the hillside and this time caught its eyes. 2 glowing yellow orbs just watching and waiting. At that point I went into a fury, grabbed my tomahawk and charged up the hill after the beast, screaming curses all the while. The watcher ran off, but neither I or the dog slept that night. The following morning we left camp at first light and began hiking up the mountain to the ridgeline which would lead us out. Atop the ridgeline in the fresh mud were a series of tracks left by an animal that officially no longer exists in the eastern US. They were catamount tracks. They commonly go by cougars in the east, but we'd been stalked by mountain lions just the same. Those tracks ran across the ridge, revealing it had been watching us and stalking us throughout the previous day as we hiked through the creek bed below. They weren't bobcat trails, I know that. They were way too big, as were those eyes I saw. I truly believe that if my dog hadn't been there to give me red flags, I would have been mauled that night, and it remains one of my personal scariest experiences ever. Red River Gorge is a beautiful and huge park filled with wildlife, rock climbing, waterfalls, dense forest, gorges and beautiful views. This is a place that feels truly isolated, disconnected from the rest of the world. One evening, in the fall, my boyfriend Duncan and I decided to go camping at the gorge. We found a campground that was as backwoods as possible. Sites were spread far from each other, and our site was on the edge of a very steep drop-off. We arrived at sunset and quickly got to setting up camp. By the time we were fully set up, the sun had set, and we began to make a fire. About 20 minutes into relaxing by the fire, we began to hear howling that didn't sound too far away. We were both freaked out by the realization there were wolves nearby, but we tried not to overreact and continued to sit by our fire. 10 minutes later, I started to hear a faint yelling about 15 feet away past the cliff edges. I told Duncan to be quiet and listen, and we both froze out of fear. A woman was screaming now. I couldn't make out any words at that point, but it was a deep, guttural shriek, a noise that I had never heard a person make in real life. Then I heard it. She was screaming, "Someone help me, please, oh my God," and repeating this over and over, howling it at the top of her lungs. I was terrified. She could have been turned around in the dark and fallen off a cliff or attacked by an animal. At this point, we both sprinted to my car, frantically climbed inside and locked the doors. I tried to call for police, but there was no service. I threw the car in reverse and sped down the dirt road to find anyone that could help, and the shrieks continued. I didn't make it far before coming across a group of 3 young men standing on the edge of the forest. I slowed down and cracked my window, still hearing the woman begging for help, and asked if they could hear that. How could they not? I told them I heard a woman crying for help in the forest, and 2 of them went sprinting into the darkness without questioning me any further. The other one just stood by my car, with no idea of what was happening. While the 2 men were somewhere in the forest, I drove further down into the dirt road until I found a spot to turn around. When I came back, the screaming had stopped, and the men were back by the side of the road. I slowed down and asked them where the woman was, and one of the men that had run into the woods answered, "Don't worry, it's funny actually. It was just a little kid at a campsite further down the trail. He was having a nightmare." I just said okay and drove away as quickly as possible. We left the campsite and went straight home. Once out the woods, we called the local police station multiple times with no answer. I know it wasn't a child. I've never heard such a primal, fearful scream in my life. It makes my skin crawl and my heart race just thinking about it. What did those men get away with that night? And what was I a witness to? I searched the local news for weeks, searching for something reporting details on what it could have been, and came across nothing. I also think it's important to note that this happened in early November of last year, after the camping season was mostly over. We saw very few people there during our time, and I think it is assumed by most people that there won't be many people around this time of year. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's excursion into the deep woods. If you did, please be sure to let me know. You know what to do. If the intro, the unboxing seemed a bit weird, I'm really sorry for that. So I recorded it all with audio, but when I went to edit it, turns out all the audio didn't record as I originally thought. So I had to narrate over it, which you know, wasn't the best idea, but the thing is, I wanted to seem as genuine as possible, and it's hard to fake surprise or excitement when you've already opened everything and stuff. So yeah, that's why I did that. But I did really like the box. You don't actually get the stuff that I got, I believe. You get different stuff if you order. So there you go. If you are interested in getting a fright crate, please check out the link in the description. They are really cool. And yeah, hopefully they send me more and I can show off more products, but I don't know if they will. It would be nice though. I did really like it. As I said, link in the description. So yeah, the video was also a bit challenging to record because Pandora wanted to get involved because we started recording and then she woke up from a nap. So yeah, it's always the way, isn't it? Hope everyone's doing well, and yeah, have a good night, guys. If there are any stories of stuff that's happened to you that you wish to share, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my Reddit. Thanks, guys. But for now, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.